I am Secretary DeAngela Burns-Wallace with the Department of Administration, and I'm excited to have you all join us this morning. I can't see. Looks like we have close to a little over 100 participants on. Welcome, welcome. And we still have a few more joining. As we do that, I'm going to do a little bit of roll call and kind of some administrative aspects to get us started. Double checking, I've seen a couple of members of my team. Alicia, Jocelyn, Samir, are all of you on?
Yes, good morning.
Yep.
Samir. All right. And Doug, are you on as well?
Yes, Secretary, I'm on.
Wonderful. These are members of our recovery office and Department of Administration team that are supporting this effort. And then I also have colleagues who are with us from Whit O'Brien. Matt, are you on?
Good morning, Secretary. I'm here.
Wonderful. That roll call is important for me because after I go through a brief presentation, this is the team that will help me answer as many questions as you can. And as I'll highlight kind of throughout, there are a number of things that are still unknown. We are committed to capturing questions and being able to pass those through to Treasury and other entities to try to get answers. And so they will be a part of helping me capture those questions throughout. We did do a session yesterday afternoon, had a great conversation, very lively, lots of questions. We used the chat box very effectively. So please feel free as we're going through to drop questions in the chat. If they're more just direct administration, a member of the team may answer you in the chat, but otherwise we'll walk through the questions and try to answer as many as we can this morning as we go through this process. As I say that, give me 1 minute, let me close my Outlook as you just heard it go off, and I don't want that doing all throughout the presentation. Perfect. All right, as we get ready to get started, I want first to say just a big thank you to the Kansas Association of Counties, Bruce and his team, as well as the League of Kansas Municipalities and Eric and his team there. I want to just send out thanks to them because they have helped us pull this group together quickly, pass out information and make the connections. And they are just great partners as we are all trying to gather every little piece of information we can as this bill hits the street and we figure out how it's going to impact us here in Kansas. So thank you for the partnership. So appreciate it. And please know it's just the beginning because we will continue to support and push information with them, through them, and collectively. And we're also sharing information from our national level organizations, which is key and critical. So I'm going to get us started and just first and foremost, remembering again, we are in the very early stages as this bill was passed into law on the 11th. We are still learning about the different pieces. This is the high level, and you've probably seen some variation of this in, whether it's the media or some of your national associations have put out kind of one-pagers or summaries. And so it is about 1.9 trillion that has come in with this bill. And one of the things that just trying to show here is really trying to put a little bit of an emphasis on the fact that, we're going to be spending time talking really about the dollars that are coming in locally to you all. There are dollars that are coming in at the state level, also to tribal governments, but there will be other pathways of dollars coming into the state to the individual households, through the stimulus checks and a few other mechanisms, but also to other recipients in other sectors. And I'll talk a little bit more about that: education, childcare, businesses directly. So there will be dollars that are flowing into our state through us at the state level, through you at the local level, but there will be other dollars that are also flowing in into and through your community. So the one thing that I can say as we have this conversation and continue to have it is this idea of communication and collaboration and coordination, because those dollars will be important for us to understand where they're going and to understand how we're leveraging them and trying to maximize the dollars that are coming into our spaces on behalf of the Kansans that we serve. So So I keep moving through. This is kind of just pictorially trying to give a little bit of a scope and scale to understand the dollars that are going to be flowing into our state. So as many of you have followed or remember, we're a part of the CRF, the CARES Act dollars, the CRF that the state distributed. If you remember, we provided $400 million to counties, and that was dispersed across the counties. And then 2 of our counties, Johnson and Sedgwick, received a direct allocation of $216 million. And this is with the CRF dollars from last year that many of the counties have used and expended over the last 8 to 10 months. To give you a comparison at the county level, based on the bright blue bar is what we are estimating is coming in under the American Rescue Plan. And you can see the amount coming into counties is greater than what we pushed out, or kind of close when you put the 216 on top of the 400. And so counties are expected to receive a significant, and in many cases, very similar to the dollar distribution that they received under CRF, just to give you a comparison. But also remember that the mechanism we used last time with CRF was money just to the counties. And so there were some counties that gave their dollars to cities or some of the larger and smaller cities, municipalities. And you'll see those as those 2 smaller dark blue bars. The dollars there, the 20 million, the 28 million, are actually dollars that originally flowed through the counties. And then the counties decided to distribute those to their cities. In this round, as you know, the counties, as well as the cities that sit over 50,000, will be receiving their distribution direct from Treasury. And you can see in that bright blue bar that the cities are anticipating to receive 252. It's an estimate, but around 250 million direct. So that is in addition to the 565 that'll be going directly to the counties. Under this bill, there are also the dollars that will be coming out to a certain identified set of non-entitlement entities. So these are the cities, the entities that have a population of 50,000 or less. And we had a lot of discussion last night about this, and so we can talk about this when we move to the Q&A. There is a definition and an explanation within the bill of what that means and who is identified. Right now, we believe it's a little over 600 entities in the state of Kansas, and we have a working list, but we're waiting for confirmation of that we have the right entities. With that, those entities that are identified will also receive around about 170 million. So think about, just comparatively, when we think about the dollars, where we are with the CRF dollars that went out into the counties, and then the counties dispersed them, either to priorities and or to their cities and other entities. This time we will have monies coming in direct to the counties, direct to the cities, and then another group that'll go to the smaller entities that will be dispersed through the state. And it will be a straight pass through. There'll be a calculation from the federal bill that determines what each entity receives. And then we will be passing it through to those smaller entities. And so there's nothing that the state does except pass it through. We'll talk a little bit about that, because we will, as we move later through, talk about how we're going to work with those entities to make sure that we can get those dollars out to them accordingly and effectively. The other thing that I want to kind of stress about these dollars, so if you think about it, particularly from a county perspective, the first round of CRF dollars, the 400 million that was distributed, and the dollars that went directly to Johnson and Sedgwick, for many counties, the top 4 areas where they spent, it was in education, it was around small business, it was around public health, and also that distribution to municipalities. Those were the priority areas where most of the dollars went from the first round. What I want to show you here and also emphasize about this bill is, as I showed a minute ago, dollars are coming to the state, dollars are coming to the counties, dollars are coming to the cities. There is also funds that will be coming to many of our priority areas directly. So there will be new dollars that are infused into education. There'll be new dollars infused into childcare, businesses, healthcare, housing, transportation. This is just a snippet, right? And there will be significant dollars that are in those spaces. We saw some dollars coming into some of these areas out of HR 133. And that was the bill that came out in late December. And there was already dollars that have been pushed into some of these areas. There will be even more with ARP coming through, and they'll be coming into your communities through these other mechanisms. The reason why I stress that is that there's an important piece of this as we think about kind of that strategic moment around these dollars and how to utilize them. The investment of these dollars is very different than where we were 8 months ago. We were really in the middle of a pandemic. We were trying to provide relief during what was impacting us here in the state and around the country and the world. And so the dollars were about that relief and reacting directly to COVID. These dollars, and I'll talk in a few minutes about kind of how they can be used, could really strategically need to be looked at more as true recovery and revitalization. And how do we leverage these dollars into things that we need to build up going forward, and not just in reaction to or a relief of the pandemic. The clock on the dollars that are coming to state and local right now, and I believe it's finalized, appear that our time period for using these dollars will be through 2024. So that really does give you the time to think about long-term investment and impact of these dollars a little bit differently. But with an important caveat of understanding, we got to know where some of these other dollars will be moving to and through our communities. So again, we're maximizing dollars. Just to give you a kind of a quick drill down to drive the point home. The bright blue on this one is dollars that were invested in education, K-12 and higher ed, between the two charts. The bright blue one was what was used from county CRF dollars. So these were counties' decisions to invest their dollars in K-12 and higher ed. And you can see 78 in K-12, 14 in higher ed. Then the next bar, that's a little bit darker blue, is CARES Act dollars that came directly into K-12 and higher ed. And those went directly to educational entities based on a formula. HR 133, which I mentioned, that was passed in December, had additional dollars that were going into K-12 and higher ed directly, again, based on a formula, a straight distribution to those entities. The last, and that big bar on the far end of both charts to the far right, is what we anticipate coming into K-12 and higher ed for through the American Rescue Plan. So you can see on K-12 alone, the amount that is estimated to come out of the ARP is more than if you totaled up all the dollars that they have seen to date. Again, with a different clock, there'll be time to spend these dollars, but understanding that and then thinking about how the dollars are coming into the counties and cities will be important about how then you leverage and use your dollars to support K-12, but may not need direct investment, but coordination and collaboration could be key and critical to maximizing those dollars. Dollars that do come into higher ed and K-12 sometimes have a bit more restriction on how they can be utilized, and the ones coming into the counties and cities may have a little bit more flexibility. So those are things to think about. Okay. I'm going to try to move through the rest of this so we can open it up and leave some time for questions. But this is an important piece of just talking about, kind of what is allowable use. And this is probably where we'll spend the most of our times in Q&A and just talking through some of this and answering questions around it. So please keep that in mind and please feel free to drop your questions in. But as we've pulled the bill apart so far, these are the big areas that have come out in terms of allowable use. Of course, respond to the public health emergency with respect to COVID, very similar to last time with CRF. But there's also an allowable use around responding to negative economic impacts And this can include assistance to households, small business, nonprofits, aid for impacted industries, things of that nature. This is an area that as more guidance come out, we'll learn more. But this idea of being able to respond to negative economic impacts really does open up a broader, I think, conversation of possibilities and investment. Another allowable use is to provide premium pay for public employees that are performing essential work, or by providing grants to eligible employers that have eligible workers who perform essential work. I'm going to have my colleague, Matt, who's with O'Brien, talk a little bit about this when we get into Q&A, as it was a question yesterday that people had a lot of interest around, and making sure we understand that premium pay. There's a formula that's in there. There's I think there's a min and a max around it that basically is saying that you can pay those essential workers above and beyond where their pay currently sits in relationship to their work related to COVID. One of the third areas of allowable use is to provide government services to the extent of reduction in revenue due to COVID-19 relative to revenues collected in the most recent full fiscal year. And then the fourth allowable use that we've identified is to make necessary investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure are specifically listed in the bill. We do believe that we will receive, kind of additional guidance that may open up the conversation around, what else could be in that space around the definition of infrastructure. So stay tuned. And again, in each of these areas, for those who were involved with CRF last year, you know that Treasury guidance will come out and it will be an iterative process, in that we'll get guidance over time, we'll get further clarification, but we're hopeful that the first round of Treasury guidance is robust based on what they learned from CRF and CARES Act distributions, and provide some really good level of guidance. Things to consider. There is no duplication of funding for revenue loss within entities. This will be very important, again, as we talk about coordination and collaboration, that you cannot use those for pension funds, and that also we know that counties and cities will be required to provide periodic reports to Treasury around their accounting. The thing here is that there will be additional guidance that we'll be looking for around the how and the what. What we hope to be able to provide from the center, and I'll speak to it a little bit more in the next slide, are things that help you as you are preparing for that reporting, templates and job aids and things of that nature, as well as technical assistance, because we know that that is a piece of it that can be daunting. But the details of the how and the when around the periodic reporting have not been released yet. So we will be tracking on that very closely. What we do know and believe at this time is that as a state, we can't do the reporting for those entities that receive their dollars directly, but that we can provide assistance and support as we all are working through and dealing with making sure that we're hitting that reporting and compliance pieces. And as always with any set of funds and federal funds in particular, if you are found that the use of these dollars does not comply with the allowable uses, that you are responsible to the U.S. Treasury to pay those amounts back. So I want to talk a little bit about just the Recovery Office. The Governor Laura Kelly is committed to helping our cities, our counties, be able to use and maximize these dollars for Kansans, to really have a depth of investment that is having impact on not only on what is happening today, but what we look like in 3 to 5 years coming out of this experience. So We are looking to provide ongoing guidance as we move through this. And so this is the first of course, we'll have resources and webinars, and we'll be pushing out information based on a recommendation yesterday. We'll probably set up a separate listserv for recipients, different than the listserv we have for our general public information, to try to share information in a timely fashion with you. So stay tuned for that. But we also, as I just mentioned, hope to put into place and to provide to you reporting templates and job aids that help you all be able to understand the Treasury guidance, as well as to be responsive to what the Treasury is asking for. We will be sharing best practices, both from that we learned from each of you, as well as what we have collected across the time of managing CRF around financial controls, monitoring, compliance, and risk management. And we can talk a little bit more when we move into the Q&A, but these will be important pieces, as some of you will have to move into a single audit space that may not have before, because of the amount that you'll be receiving directly. And so wanting to make sure that we're providing resources and best practices around how to do that. But also, in a more concrete way, we're looking to stand up a state master contract for certain contractual services like auditing and compliance work, where we'll have, our goal is to stand up this contract where there will be multi vendors that would be available. And so that you, as a political subdivision, would just be able to tap into that pre-negotiated state contract, select the vendor that you need and the services that you need, and be able to stand up that instrument faster for you. So that is one of the things that we are working on. Overall, again, focusing on strategic collaboration, that will be key. We want to be of assistance in helping and not hindering. And we sit in a place where we believe we can pass information in a unique way and help as you all navigate the management of these dollars. The one thing for those entities that are less than 50,000, that eventually will be, once we have that fully identified list, we will be working to make sure that we have complete and accurate information first, so that we can start those communication mechanisms. But then the Department of Administration will be working directly to ensure that we can get those dollars to you in a timely fashion and to the right people. Lastly, we have always had and continue to have our recovery email box, and it is recovery@ks.gov. Many of the members of the team that I mentioned earlier who are on with me today help to monitor that, and we will be asking you all to use that for questions that may arise. As I said, we are trying to collect questions to make sure that we are getting as many answers as possible, because there's still many things that we don't know. As I move to wrap up, just a little bit about timeline considerations and thinking of understanding how some of this is going to go. Of course, ARP is passed. We anticipate that it'll be probably another couple of weeks before we get clean Treasury guidance that helps us push out, additional information. And then remember, there may be updates that come along throughout the way, but we do feel that there will be robust guidance that is available in about 2 to 3 weeks. And then one of the things that's important to note, I think that made it into one of the very last versions of the bill, is that municipalities and counties will receive their funds in 2 tranches. And so 50% would come initially, and then the remaining 50% is no earlier than 12 months from the first payment. And then for the Treasury is required to pay out no later than 60 days after enactment. And so those are just things to keep in mind. And as I mentioned earlier, that funds that are coming to the counties, the cities, and the state, based on the language in the last bill, will need to be fully expended by December 31, 2024. So just a couple of next steps, thinking about while you're awaiting requirements, things that you could be doing to help, get you ready, starting conversations, making sure you have structures in place, looking at your revenue loss, looking at prior use of funds for COVID-19, where some of your gaps are, where some of your needs still are. But even more importantly, I'm going to go back to stressing this idea of strategic investment for opportunities in your region, areas for collaboration, not just within your entity, but maybe across the region or even across the state, as we will be doing something very similar with the dollars that come in at the state level, and looking at our strategic priorities and looking at where we can make long-term investments, and looking for partners across the state to do that across our agencies. So please know that we're doing this work at the same time as you, because we do have the dollars that will be coming in at the state level, similar to those that you all are receiving at the county and the city levels. And so we're thinking about that strategic long-term investment and what that looks like, who the partners are, and how we can best leverage these dollars. So getting this work and kind of getting your spaces in order, knowing that it's coming. Someone asked yesterday and said that their accountants had said, they probably need to beef up a couple of positions around, audit and accounting, thinking about what your structure is and what that support is going to look like. And again, thinking of us as well as we try to create spaces where we can provide technical assistance, stand up the master contracts. It'll take us a few weeks, but we hope that we'll be close on timing as more of the guidance comes out and you all can start thinking about what your needs are and how this maps onto those needs. So with that, again, recovery@ks.gov is our shared email, and encourage you to send us questions as they come up or as you're thinking about them. Many of your questions others will have. We will be having some of the same questions as well. So no question is too small for us to try to see if we can help get you an answer. With that, I am going to move into our question queue, and I'm going to ask my team to help me here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. It's easier for me to see the chat that way. So apologies there. All right, I'm going to go back up to the top of the queue. All right. Sorry, I'm reading through the first handful of chats. All right, let's start with, I see a question. It looks like it's from Shawnee County, and asking for a little bit detail around a county over 50K would get it directly from Treasury. A city over 50K in that county would get it directly from US Treasury. However, any city under 50K in that county, it would go through the state pass-through. I would say that the gist of that is yes. There's some nuances around the cities or entities that are less than 50K. There's some specific guidelines that they've identified to say who qualifies to receive that. And that's what we're waiting on in terms of guidance and a clean list. Right now, we've identified that as about 600 entities around the state, but those will come through the state as a pass through to those entities. All other entities, all counties, and the cities over 50K will get directly from Treasury. Matt, is there anything that you want to add on that?
Just a clarification around that Shawnee question that we addressed later on in the questions as you read through them, but all counties would get a direct allocation regardless of their population size. Entitlement cities, so those greater than 50,000 that meet that definition, would get a direct allocation from the Treasury. And the state is only being used as a distribution agent to those entities. So just to go ahead and address, what compliance looks like and reporting, those not entitlements, as we're currently reading the bill, would be responsible for directly providing periodic reporting to the Treasury. So just because you receive the funds from the state doesn't mean that the state will enforce compliance and collect reporting. But as the Secretary mentioned, there will certainly be some support around templates, tools to help your jurisdictions and making sure that you adhere to the correct processes.
Thanks, Matt. Looks like there's a question around premium pay. If that has not been answered in the chat, do we want to talk a little bit around what we understand around premium pay, Matt?
Sure, and I did not address it. I figured it would be easier to do so verbally. So There is this provision for premium pay, and that's for both public employees as well as providing grants to employers in your community to help them provide premium pay for essential workers. Now, there is terminology around eligible worker, but there isn't a definition of who is an eligible worker. So that's where we'll want to make sure that we get guidance from the Treasury to understand exactly what they're defining as both eligible and essential. Although they do provide caps on how much that premium pay or just what that represents. And so the footnote that we have in there that'll be included in the presentation is up to $13 per hour in premium pay, and that's capped at $25,000 in aggregate per employee. So premium pay can be both for public employees as well as employers within your community if you wanted to stand up a bespoke program to provide assistance for keeping essential workers engaged in the workforce throughout the pandemic.
Perfect. Looks like there are a couple of questions around the infrastructure investments in like water and sewage. Did those get addressed?
They did not, and I'm happy to address that as well. So this is, as you heard the Secretary say earlier, they provided representative examples. We don't believe that they are exclusive. So we do think that there is going to be some flexibility in how you define infrastructure, whether that be public health infrastructure, IT infrastructure. They gave representative examples like broadband, water, and sewer. And I see a lot of questions around, does that include storm sewers? So we'll have to look at the Treasury guidance. I think that they provided representative examples to provide intent of Congress. But as we learned from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, intent of Congress isn't always interpreted that way from the Treasury. So let's look very closely at what the Treasury guidance that comes out says around what infrastructure equates to.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. There was a question that was specific to, it looks like EMS services, and that the pandemic destroyed their volunteer EMS services, and that if the dollars could be utilized to transition to a contracted EMS service. Again, I think as we get more guidance, we'll be able to provide feedback. We always want to be careful not to say like, yes, that would be, allowable or not. But I feel like this falls in that range that the case could be made depending on how and what the dollars are being used for, because EMS services being a critical piece and component to continue to combat the pandemic as well as to build back. Matt, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on that one.
I think you're exactly right, Secretary. I think the case could be made that that's a second line economic impact, and this does provide some broad flexibility on addressing economic impacts. And so I think that there's a pathway there, but again, subject to final review of any Treasury guidance.
Perfect. Next set of questions, it looks like there's a question around, and team, please help me if I skip one or miss one. There is a question around child care development block grants. What I will say is kind of twofold. One, there were some dollars for child care development block grants that were in HR 133. And there are additional dollars that are coming through with ARP. Those will be administered, I believe, by DCF, and there will be more to come in that space soon. What I will tell you, though, is that beyond the child care development block grants, there are actually other dollars in ARP around early childhood education as well. So it's not just the child care development block grants, but there is more money infused into those. So that's where it'll be important as we start to learn more and really take it apart to understand where different dollars are going and how they can be leveraged in the community. Some of them are direct to providers and entities. Some of them have to go through a competitive process or an application process. So again, the dollars come in slightly differently, they'll be pushed out slightly differently, but that is part of what we're hoping to be able to help provide that information on as we get clarity in those different spaces. What dollars are moving where? How do people access them? When can they access them? Is this an application or is this a direct distribution? When we talk about some of those other priority areas like early childhood education and things of that nature. So does anyone on the team want to add? Alicia, I know you've worked with DCF in this space directly.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, there's a lot of dollars. I think DCF is still working through how to spend the dollars that came as part of HR 133. So, I mean, it's just an ongoing conversation.
The only thing I'll add there, Secretary, is we got a question yesterday that hasn't been asked yet, but the same is for some of the mental health and substance abuse grants. There's a rather historic allocation of funds coming through that that'll be administered by KDADS. And so I think that's part of this theorized support from the state, is being able to be a conduit of information between those state agencies down to local jurisdictions to understand what entities within your communities what resources are available to them to access from any one of those state agencies.
All right, so there is a couple of questions I'm seeing. One around how will cities of 750 residents know if they meet the outline definitions of ARP, and who will they deal with? And then there's also kind of a question a little bit later that's, how the state will be reaching out to counties and partners, and what will that look like and time frame for that. I'm going to tie a little bit of those two together. What I will say is that, kind of overall outreach, we're going to, from this point forward, we'll kind of begin right away of, grabbing entities and pushing out information. Doug, who is on the call, many of you that sit in counties know Doug and the technical assistance team that has supported us throughout CRF. We will be standing up something very similar so that there is a contact kind of in different pockets and areas around the state, and you know who that contact is and who to call. And we're standing all of our side up. But if I can get probably Matt and Jocelyn to talk a little bit about the various cities, how the definition, what we know, and then some of the outreach we have started to do and will continue to do. Jocelyn, maybe you can address that secondly, in relationship as we move past those that are getting their direct dollars and those that will be coming through the state, what we expect that outreach to look like. But Matt, do you want to start by talking a little bit about what we understand about which have been meet the definition within ARP?
Sure, and the good news is we were ahead of the curve on this. As soon as the bill came out, we read it, we understood the implications of that and what the state would need to do to define that list. That has evolved as amendments were proposed and then subsequently incorporated into the bill. So Jocelyn from Accounts and Reports and her team have done a great job of actually collecting a lot of information. We have stress tested some of those assumptions. We've looked at all the available guidance that's being provided by national level affiliates to local jurisdictions. And we believe we have a list that is representative of the intent of the definition. And that's about a little over 600 cities. Now that is down from 1,800 that was put together prior to the latest amendment. So I think that we're holding on releasing that list just because we want to make sure that we see what additional guidance the Treasury may put out. But we have already started to pull together budgets because there's this cap that each of these entities is receiving the non-allocation can't receive greater than 75% of their total adopted budget. So Jocelyn, do you want to just quickly talk about the efforts your team has done in recent weeks?
Yeah, sure. And let me expand just a little bit on some of the conversations that are happening around that list too. The reduction, as we understand it, was due to the classification by census as minor civil divisions. So that's why a lot of those townships dropped off. Those are entities with less of a government role. Others dropped off in instances of overlapping governments. But the list that we're working on, while we believe that that's really close to what it's going to be, came out just before the bill was actually signed. So we do want to just make sure that's final before we send it out. But what we're going to head and doing is working with the county clerks to make sure that we have all the right contact information. And then as soon as we get confirmation on that list, we will reach out directly to those entities with very specific instructions on what we need to make those payments, how we expect those to be made. We will reiterate some of this information and any new guidance we've received in the meantime on what can be done with those funds and where more information will be found.
All right, couple of more as we move through. I want to, as we talk right now, as we're just talking about kind of processes, there's a question a little bit further down that asks about local government submit certification. Is there guidance about this process? So that local government submits certification is, if I'm not mistaken, going to be a step with Treasury, and you will receive direct guidance on what needs to be provided and when and how. As the state has done this numerous times to receive funds, some of you have not done it directly, but there will be guidance around that, that they will push out, as well as timelines, how to submit it and what information is required. So you can anticipate that as soon as we see any of that, we will share as well. There are a couple of questions around, can funds be spent on already budgeted items, and can funds be invested until spent? And so Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about already budgeted items? And the question about being invested until spent, I think that may be around like putting the funds into an interest-bearing account, which we believe it is allowable. We haven't seen language against that. So Matt, can you talk a little bit about already budgeted items and any language we've seen in the bill?
Sure. Well, let me actually address the second part first, okay. Which is, yeah, I think that we saw that even with the emergency rental assistance funds that was provided through the Treasury in this mechanism, the coronavirus relief funds, you could put them in an interest-bearing account. We certainly believe that that's the case. What I will offer, though, is that when you receive the funds, it's very advisable that you put them in their own account. So depending on your level of sophistication around segregation of funds and what sort of financial control system you have, I think the cleanest way to do this is to put them in their own accounts. So you can track ins and outs pretty cleanly. As to the use of funds, I think that we're going to see some of the same guidance from the Coronavirus Relief Fund as it pertains to previously budgeted items. Because there's broader flexibility on the economic impact piece, I think that's where it does deviate a little bit from Coronavirus Relief Fund, and there would be potential to address some previously budgeted items. Again, this is subject to final guidance from the Treasury, but I think that the intent from Congress was to provide a very flexible funding source to allow your local jurisdiction to address your immediate needs and to provide you that jurisdictional control. That being said, it does mean you're accountable for use of funds. And so you do have to keep a close eye on the Treasury guidance and then fall into a line with it. My hope is after a year of administering the Coronavirus Relief Fund, Treasury has gotten the hang of this. And so guidance should come out pretty quickly after the funds are being distributed. And hopefully it won't change. But I would say that some items, certainly labor, I see some questions around, can we help scale workforces around certain activities? I think the answer is pretty simply yes, if it's to help address some of the COVID-19 crises that you're dealing with. I think more broadly, there's probably a fair amount of thought towards economic stimulus programs, workforce development, what you can do to become more economically resilient, but also, how can you shore up some of your public health services in your community using this quite flexible funding source.
Thanks, Matt. As of right now, the official allocation amounts have not been released. I think that there are a lot of estimates floating out there. We've worked our own estimates. I think some of your national associations have come up with estimates as well. We're hesitant, of course, to always like push numbers out because then people get wed to them. And a lot of those earlier numbers were based on the House bill, and there were some significant changes in the Senate bill that moved money around a little bit, or put it in different buckets or different ways to access it. And we're still waiting on some of that. So again, we're anticipating Treasury guidance out in 2 to 3 weeks. And as that, I think the allocation amounts will become out at around that time as well, and become cleaner. But there are estimates that I think many of us are working off or through and around. So there is a question about fire districts, and I have no background or information there. I don't know if there's anyone on the call who does. If not, we can try to round that up. I'm not aware of anything specific to fire districts. Anyone?
The only thing I'll say is that they're not getting an allocation through this funding source. So it's just these municipal cities really that are getting the allocations, and then the counties. But that being said, that there are other federal grant programs that have received funding through the CARES Act, through HR 133 in December, as well as the ARP. And I think when we look at the hyper flexible FEMA disaster recovery fund that just received 40 odd some billion, they may stand up programs specifically for the firefighters. There is a specific program for that around preparedness. So that may just be something you want to keep an eye on to see if you could potentially apply for that.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. There is a question around, can the funds be used to meet the expenses of your federal audits? And the answer to that is unequivocally yes. Just as with CRF funds could be used, these funds will continue to be able to be used for your audit purposes. And so that is something that we encourage, particularly if you know that you will need those, if you fall into that single audit category, that you do want to allocate those dollars. That's also why we're hoping to stand up a master contract at the state level with multi-vendors that you could tap into. For some of you that maybe haven't had to do this before or have never had to do a single audit, but these dollars will push you over that threshold to do so. And if you don't have someone that you've already worked with, we're hoping to be able to have a handful of companies that, again, that have been pre-negotiated that you could then tap into instead of stand up your own contract for the necessary services. Jocelyn or Matt, I don't know if you want to add anything as the local governments are thinking about their preparation or setting aside dollars or resources around their audits and that preparation side.
I'll actually offer a word of caution, which was in the coronavirus relief fund, when they actually went through the uniform guidance and said this applies and this doesn't apply. For CRF, there wasn't that much that actually you had to ensure, internal controls, allowable costs, those types of things around cost reasonableness, procurement practices. I think that we're going to see a turn around use of these funds where a number of those subparts of uniform guidance are going to apply. So I would just say that what you should be doing now is doing an assessment of your capacity, and that's financial controls, what sort of financial staff you have, depending on the amount of funding that you're receiving and how it aligns with the total amount of your regular adopted budget. I think you need to do a quick assessment of just, do we need to augment our existing efforts, add a couple of resources here to make sure that we're doing this the right way. If you're going to use entities within your city or county, of course, making sure that you do risk assessments prior to providing them funding. If you're going to go through procurement, making sure that you follow the right procurement processes. And those I think are some of the initial considerations you should be doing now. Jocelyn, do you have anything to add?
Just to say, when we point you to some more resources and start communicating on some of those best practice protocols like we referenced, we do plan to have some of those compliance considerations and best practices We've got for example, like checklists to help you determine, is it a subrecipient or a contractor? That changes the scope of what your compliance requirements would be. Best practices in documentation management and documentation of internal controls, things like that. So do begin assessing with what you already know, but if you're new to this scale of federal funds that may be subject to single audit, we will be providing some additional guidance and pointing you to those publications and compliance requirements.
Thank you both. There's a question about hiring freeze and filling positions, and can the funds be utilized for that? Matt, do you think you can address that, or is that something we want to take offline and get some more information?
Okay. So this is from, who should I see? So
It's
we had put a hiring
Yusha
freeze
Reddy.
because- We have put a hiring freeze because of COVID and staff has been overburdened. Would filling these positions county to utilize these funds? So again, I think because of some of the broad flexibility on some of addressing some of your economic impacts, I think especially when you look at the allowability to address loss of revenue as a result, presumably you cut services because of a reduction in revenue. I think you may be able to account for that as the bill's currently written, which would have the same net effect of being able to get back to a sustainable level of service for your constituents. But I would also offer that if it's for increased work that's directly related to COVID-19, you're an eligible FEMA recipient. So depending on what that work looks like, you could actually bring temp labor on to wrap some services around there. That's a potential avenue. There are ways to get that cost recovery in place that you should explore, but there's probably a pathway for you to bring individuals back into the fold of your organization.
Thanks. There's a couple of questions around premium pay. There's one, and then there's one I don't know if you all can see. Please be careful if you're sending messages in the chat. Please send them to everyone and not directly to me, as my team is helping me manage the questions. So there's one question that talks about premium pay and back pay for work essentially done by essential workers during pandemic 2020. So that's one question. One of the questions, I'm not sure you can see, is premium pay, does premium pay have to be added to an hourly wage, or can it be paid as a bonus for essential workers? So Matt, can you tackle those two? One is back pay for work done during the pandemic in 2020. And the other is, does it have to be added to an hourly wage, or can it be paid as a bonus for essential workers?
I think we'll have to say that that's to be determined. So we saw in the coronavirus relief fund that they allowed for issuance of hazard pay, but not workforce bonuses. Now they've used a new terminology and labeling something premium pay. So I think the intent is it looks a lot like hazard pay, but expands the definition of who's eligible for hazard pay to say that, essential workers may not just be frontline workers. It may be workers that are essential for you to ensure continuity of operations. But we'll have to look at the bill, or I'm sorry, the guidance from the Treasury when it comes out. And I think especially when it looks at allowable use of funds, right? We know from the bill text when the end date of use of funds is, which is December 31st, 2024. What we don't know is how far back you can go. So we'll have to keep a close eye on what guidance comes out from the Treasury around that and see if they put restrictions on things like we talked about earlier around previously budgeted positions or addressing retroactive premium pay.
Thank you. There's a question about if the school districts will get their allocation directly from U.S. Treasury. The school districts will get their allocation similar to how they have in other rounds. It actually goes through, if I'm not mistaken, the Department of Education. But again, it's formulaic, and so it will go, then it'll be a pass-through direct to them. It won't come through the counties or cities, if that's just to make sure we're clear on that. Am I stating that correctly, Matt?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And another, so just real quick, I saw a note from Pam K that, is my audio okay? It looks like there was trouble hearing me.
You're a little bit if you could get a little bit louder, it could be helpful.
How about now? Any better?
Try again.
Let's see if I can raise my microphone a little bit.
That's better.
Okay, that is correct. Yeah, I think that the only thing I wanted to reintroduce, because it's been a while since we've looked at the slides, and I want to remind everyone, the funding is split in 2 tranches, and so you only get 50% of the money essentially up front. The other 50% would come within 12 months. So just a word of caution as you start to ambitiously look at how you're going to utilize funds is that you're really only going to have 50% of it available once it is distributed.
All right, keep moving through. Oh, I lost my place. Hold on one second. Sorry. All right, there was a question about what a small city be able to use on roads within the town. I don't know that we would have a specific answer to that.
Yeah, I want to bring up something though, is part of it is looking at this strategically, because something I brought up on the call yesterday was we're keeping an ear to DC, not just around the ARP funds, but there's now been murmurs about a follow-up infrastructure package, the long theorized major multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure package to address some of our crumbling infrastructure around the country. So we want to keep an eye on that, because if it looks like that's trending towards potentially being passed by Congress, presumably it would include a lot of assistance for local governments to address roads, bridges, other critical infrastructure. And you don't want to lose your funding optimization if you use this hyper flexible funding for something where there's additional funding coming out. So it's not to say that hold on to it and don't support those initiatives, but it may be something that we want to maybe keep an eye at to DC and see if this infrastructure bill gets any traction before making definitive decisions.
All right, there is a question about the dollars that are going directly to the state. So very similarly to the CRF dollars for CARES, there are dollars that are coming into the state, just like you all are receiving dollars at the local government level. Right now, the projection of the dollars that are coming into the state at the state level for the state's discretion is around, I think, 1.6 billion. Those dollars will be very much like you are doing. We are doing similar exercises in looking at the priorities that have been set out at the state level. A lot of those, for those that followed the process last year, the SPARK committee was brought together to identify priorities to use the CRF dollars around. If you look at those priorities are still a key and critical to where the state is and where we want to go, from economic business resilience to public health, education, and a few other pockets, connectivity. And so at the state level, we will be doing very similar exercises to what you all are doing at looking at investments that were made over the last year, what has been the impact of those, where our gaps still sit, but also really looking at this, that larger strategic investment as well. Where can we leverage state dollars to have immediate and long-term sustainable impact for those dollars? So each of our agencies are doing probably very similarly to the work that you all will be doing, and looking at the partnerships that they have, the things that they've had in the works or are looking to move through, to see where we can identify across the state what these investments look like. So with that, just know that again, we'll be following a process at the state level. And as we develop on our side, we'll be sharing that information out as well. So as you can imagine, from the standpoint of the Recovery Office, we're trying to help on both sides. We support state agencies and the governor's office and the legislator on the direction of the state funds. And at the same time, we're standing up resources to provide support out to the local governments. So our work is twofold. So there's a question about some specific purchases and if they think that they would be allowable. What I would say is, not to get into the specifics again. I think these are those areas where, as we get additional guidance, and if you believe and can make the case that they fit into one of the allowable categories, that there could be that. And these are the types of things that I think that we hope that we can help be supportive in terms of if there are places or spaces where there's a question or just trying to get some feedback on kind of best practices and what we think may or may not be allowable. We learned a lot under CRF. And as we've already stated, some of the guidelines will be different here, but there's a lot that are very similar. And so I think in the long run, and this is specifically, I think it was to David who had a number of things that he was asking about, that I think that we'll have a better sense of that after we get more guidance, and can definitely be a resource. So I don't want to say that it is or isn't. I don't know if anybody else, Matt, if you can see that question.
Yeah, I did see the question from David, and I think that understanding how it's going to be utilized, I see it says support COVID-19 response, but does that include testing? Does that include vaccines, right? Because there's a potential pathway for FEMA reimbursement for some of that, especially after some change in guidance that occurred in January. So I think that there's opportunities to look at what you're doing or what you're intending to do and explore all available funding. And then again, looking at the Treasury guidance for around this funding source. And if it's to help you address your immediate COVID-19 needs, presumably probably an eligible expense, pending validation through that guidance. But I'm a big proponent of funding optimization. So, broaden the horizon and just see what other funding is potentially out there. And I bring up the FEMA example just because, again, they have expanded eligibility to include, vaccine support, testing support at 100% cost reimbursement.
Got it. It looks like there's a question just around administrative positions and being able to add them, and can that be covered? I think we already talked a little bit about this. The one thing that, to keep in mind is that, yes, if you're, adding staff specifically to support these funds or in relationship to that, they're, again, understanding how they're going to be used, and that direct relationship will be important. And that it's not just supplanting other positions or funding for other, previously funded positions. The other thing is just being also mindful that, these are dollars that even though we have until 2024 to utilize them, they really function in some ways as one-time dollars, right? So being careful just across the board as you use these dollars, whether it's with staffing to support this work directly or other things, of recognizing where these dollars are utilized and what are long-term implications for being able to sustain those positions, if it's positions, or recognizing that they are funded for a limited period of time, or as you look at other ways that you're using these dollars, how the long-term impact could also be budget-wise for how the dollars are leveraged or utilized. I think we've talked about the certification of funds. Again, notification will come from Treasury around how to do so, when to do so, and all the guidelines there. And dollars will not be released from Treasury until a certification has been approved for those that were receiving the dollars directly. For those that will be receiving through the state, we will have our own process to make sure that we have certified the necessary information and before that they are released.
Secretary, did we answer the substance use question?
Okay. Yeah, you broke up, Alicia. I am sorry. I could not hear you.
Were we able to answer the mental health and substance use question?
Oh, I may have missed it. I apologize. I am gliding through. Can you read the question for me?
Can you talk about the mental health and substance use money included in the act?
Oh, okay. And Alicia, you might actually be one of the best people to answer that again. I think as Matt had mentioned when we were talking about the child care early education, there were dollars that were included in HR 133 around mental health, and there are also dollars that are in ARP. Again, we're waiting on, I think, a little bit more information, particularly on the ARP dollars. Some of those, if I remember correctly, can be moved out directly to providers. Others may be an application process, but we know that there are significant dollars that are in there. I don't know that we have a level of detail of what those look like. Matt or Alicia, if either of you have a little bit more insight or color around it, please feel free to add.
The thing I want to add is that most block grants are formulaic, and so based on your population or other low income status or population proportionality of X demographic, you receive a certain allocation. This happens to be one that can be competitive, so they have a certain allocation of funds at the federal level. States have to compete for those funding since they have to build a compelling case for how they're going to use those funds and how much they need. KDADS has very much been on top of this since basically March of last year, but now we're applying additional focus, and that is likely soon going to include reaching out to a number of the mental health services providers and substance abuse providers within the state to really build kind of coalition support, but also to solicit information about what sort of thought leadership's already been put into initiatives so that they could be incorporated into these competitive applications. And then with some of the more formulaic funding, building a strategic plan that is not just looking at FY21, but extends into 2022, 2023, really using it as a springboard for sustainable funding from the federal government. So there's a lot of effort being applied in that space. And I think the hope is we can provide a conduit of information to each of your jurisdictions. If there's a specific need that you have, we can facilitate that connection with KDAD and see how that can be incorporated into a grant application or an existing funding initiative.
Thanks, Matt. There was a question. It says, will small cities be able to ask for more money if they have sewer projects that will help with revenue in the future of the city if they don't receive enough to pay for it with the allotted amounts given? So I want to make sure that we're being clear around, again, if you think about what happened through the original CRF dollars and the distribution of dollars, those went out to the counties. And then the counties were able to set up various priorities and initiatives and how those monies and those dollars moved, as we did at the state with a set of priorities. What I will say is that as we all continue and learn and figure out how we're going to leverage these dollars, this is where that early coordination and conversations and collaborations across these dollars will be important, to have these types of conversations to understand where dollars are. I don't know that there is a quote unquote place to ask for more money. And so understanding that there will be allocated amounts to the counties, allocated amounts to the cities, and then allocated amounts to the non-entitlement entities. But dollars can be combined, they can be leveraged, they could be utilized strategically across those spaces, as well as I think Matt was alluding to earlier, around some broader infrastructure projects. They're depending on what you're looking at. In this instance, it's sewer is provided, but there are also dollars that'll come into some state entities that can be maybe leveraged back into communities for partnership, particularly around things like connectivity and transportation. So I think that there's, I don't want to say this is a no or a yes. I think this is one of those areas where it's a great possibility to start thinking and having conversations strategically about what it could look like or what the needs are, and understanding where your needs are in preparation for when we know more. Are we ready to put the plans together to act on where we know our needs are? So I think someone asked about, and this may have been earlier in our conversation, when we know the amounts that the populations under 50,000 will receive as soon as things come out from Treasury. We are still in a holding and a waiting pattern. We need to get the confirmation of the entities that the dollars will go to, and then the formulas can then be applied and to those entities. So we're still probably a couple of weeks out. We will be capturing a lot of what was covered in these two. My team has already started to do so and turn those into kind of FAQs as well as detailed information. But as always, if there is a piece of something that you missed or had a question around, please drop us a note, recovery@ks.gov. All right, I'm looking. Roads and bridges are not specifically mentioned as allowable use for funds. Will there be future clarification? And again, I think we address this as part of that. We know that there's going to be more guidance and probably more leeway in that infrastructure conversation, both within this bill and future bills. So I would just say stay tuned there. The webinars are recorded. We typically put our materials out on our website, the Recovery Office website, but we'll also be partnering with the league and the association to make sure that this information and all the information we're providing is accessible. There's a question about HVAC systems for better ventilation and efficiency. And is there something within the education piece where this will be allowable within counties? Matt, do you want to take that? I think that there's definitely potential there. And potentially with a couple of different pots of money. But do you want to speak to what we know or what could be thought about in that space?
That's right. I think there likely is potential, especially if you can tie it to measures that you're taking related to COVID-19 that maybe you weren't able to accomplish with the Coronavirus Relief Fund when we were really aggressively targeting a December date, right? So I think that's what prevented a lot of these, not what I'll call major capital improvement projects, but certainly allowable projects, was just the timeline. Now that we have more time, it should enable you to think about some of the things you were thinking about using coronavirus relief funds on, but just didn't have the time to do it. And that includes IT infrastructure, something that's near and dear to the Secretary's heart. And so, just looking at what measures that you can take to just become more efficient, better, but also to address certain items that allow you to get back to a steady state of people working in an environment that's safe for them.
The last question I see in the queue asks about what kind of technical assistance will be available to counties to clarify what is allowable as we proceed. So a couple of things I want to say there, and then Matt, you're welcome to chime in. First and foremost, understand that when we provide technical assistance, as we did throughout CRF, we're using our best understanding, the expertise that we have to leverage in the knowledge and the feedback that we're getting through other pockets, through other mechanisms, as well as at the federal level. And I say that because I want to be very clear about, like when we say, we're not quote unquote certifying that this is or is not allowable. We can provide guidance and assistance and some directions around what we believe, what we've seen, what works. And then in some instances, what we know is pulled out of the text that is truly not allowable. And when we can point to it, but it's not always that black and white. What I will say is what we are trying to assess right now is the type of assistance that we will stand up and what that will look like. And as we, just like you are trying to do the work in preparation, we're doing the same. We will be sharing those resources out in terms of what level that looks like and, how to contact and what type of support we think we'll be able to provide, understanding that from, again, as I talked about, our office, we are supporting both internal to state operations as well as the local government operations, not just the counties. And we stood up technical assistance for the counties during our CRF distribution. But now there's a broader group of entities between the counties and the cities and the additional 600 smaller entities. And so we have to look at what that looks like and what we can support. But our goal is to, again, try to push out tools, checklists, job aids, and things, frequently asked questions, interpretation of guidance that gets you, 65, 75% of the way to answers that you need, and then to ramp up what we can do around technical assistance to, help you get the rest of the way there as best we can, making connections, again, sharing those best practices. So, Matt, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about how technical assistance has looked in the past and how it might be a little bit different.
Right. I think that the only difference between what was provided previously and what we're envisioning for this is that the state provided those funds and was accountable for their use. One of the things that we're doing on the county side is there's going to be a survey going to counties. It's going to ask, how did you use technical assistance? What was beneficial? That will help inform us on what sort of model we can create around this. Ultimately, the state's not accountable for use of these ARP funds, specifically that you're going to get directly from the Treasury. That doesn't mean that it's not important for the state to help you with the compliance side of it. And so I think a lot of it is thought leadership and strategic initiatives, compliance considerations, tools, templates, job aids, regular coordination, just so that there could be a network to share concepts and ideas, but also multi-jurisdictional partnerships on some of the initiatives that you're thinking about when you're looking at, say, like a broadband initiative. And there's a lot of funding coming through education, including some for broadband. So, could you actually partner with the school and expand and piggyback off of what they're going to use some of their funding for? We can help bring some of those pieces to the table and then just give you better visibility into what the state's using their funds for. And more importantly, we saw lots of questions around child care development block grants, but so too is there going to be just traditional community development block grants and commerce-oriented stimulus type initiatives, and just providing that broad transparency, but also a network to share concepts and ideas.
All right. Well, our queue is empty, but myself and the team will stay on. We have about, I think, 12 more minutes scheduled. So if there are other things, please feel free to either drop them in the chat, or you can also, just open up your mic. But I will say to the larger group, thank you for joining us. We don't have all the answers yet, and we probably never will as we learned during CRF, but we are committed to being a partner in trying to get answers to you, to get the support, because at the end of the day, when we get this right across our organizations, when we can leverage these dollars and our understanding, it is going to impact Kansans in every direction. So we want to continue to be of assistance, even though our role changes a bit in relationship to some aspects. And as we have new partners who are coming to the table that'll be receiving dollars directly that didn't manage them during the first process. And so helping you all learn and understand what some of the ins and outs and nuances of all of this is. Again, thank you to our partners at the League and the association for helping us get you to the table, and just know that this is the beginning of the conversation, and when we know more, we will share more. So have a wonderful rest of your week, and happy St. Patrick's Day for those who partake. With that, we'll stay on if anybody has additional questions. All right, team, I'm not seeing any questions.
Broadband issue. Is that detail available somewhere that I'm just not finding it? My question is,
Pam, I think, is that Pam? We're losing you. You're going in and out.
yeah, I'm sorry. I've been kind of having audio problems listening too, so I don't know if that's part of my broadband problem.
No, you were asked, and so I heard that first part of you asked about the broadband. Go
Yeah.
ahead and repeat your question.
What I'm getting at is things like generators, backup generators for critical facilities and that are dependent on broadband and that type of thing. Would that piece of this maybe stretch that far, or is that wishful thinking?
So Matt is welcome to join him. Pam, I would say that there's going to be there's actually a number of different pots that touch into broadband. There's not a broadband pot. There's one that is broadband and connectivity, but then there's broadband that's built into education, and there's broadband that's built into public health. So there are like multiple pockets of pots where it touches on broadband. But I would also say that there's probably other pots that could support that as well, as kind of building back up that critical infrastructure and relationship of trying to deliver those necessary services.
Right.
So I think that there might be multiple ways to get at that depending on use case and where it sits and things of that nature. Matt, I don't know if you want to speak to that any further.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, without understanding the exact use case, I mean, I think, some critical infrastructure that relies on, steady state and stable broadband access, and you're trying to make sure that you have that resiliency. There could be a potential of 2 or 3 different funding sources, but I think right now we're just looking at bill text with each of those respective programs. We'll look at how the guidance is being pushed out, and then you can maybe potentially wrap a number of different funding sources to achieve the same outcome.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
And Pam, the video will be posted on the Recovery Office website in a couple of days. And so hopefully you can play it back if there's some details that you missed. If you have questions that didn't get answered or you couldn't hear, send us a note at recovery@ks.gov and we'll try to get you those answers directly as well. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you for doing this. It's been very helpful.
And Pam, one more comment. You heard me mention a couple times, this funding source. And the other reason I bring it up is because outside of disaster events, there are regular emergency management preparedness grants that are available through FEMA that are typically competitive. But the intent is around hazard mitigation, but also critical infrastructure resiliency. So things like generators to provide that resiliency around, healthcare or public safety infrastructure, there could be potential sources there. It requires developing applications and then using the state as a conduit to obtain that funding. But that's even outside of a disaster event. So there are periodic funding sources like that you can tap into.
Right. I am not seeing any additional questions. We are right at the top of the hour. So thank you, team. Thanks to all that were able to join. And I think we are done. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.